Good afternoon, and welcome to this special Brennan Center for Justice event. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. I am Rosemary Nadiri, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center, and I manage a project called Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. First, we are so grateful for the partnership of law enforcement leaders on this event, as well as the support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation that made this work possible. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. While we cannot support or oppose any candidate for office, we can, and today we will, vigorously debate the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. Civility is important for all of us. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided, and please follow along with the conversation on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. And now to today's program. Leaders across the nation are wrestling with their approach to misdemeanors, like shoplifting, loitering, and low-level drug possession. Some are pursuing alternatives to the traditional approach of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. But reformers must contend with growing pushback, calls to step up enforcement of these offenses in the wake of public concerns about crime and social disorder. A Brennan Center study released last month examines court data in New York City, which has long been at the center of criminal justice debates around the country, to better understand trends in misdemeanor enforcement and the concerns associated with it. The findings from the report shed light on just how massive the misdemeanor enforcement system is, how enforcement has changed in recent years, and the toll that it takes on individuals, communities, and our government resources. Here to discuss the issues around misdemeanor enforcement and paths to building long-term public safety, I am thrilled to introduce our panelists. Today we have Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer in the MacArthur Foundation's Criminal Justice Program, Josephine Hahn, a Senior Research Fellow in the Brennan Center's Justice Program and the lead author of the report, and Sheriff Jerry Clayton of Washtenaw County, Michigan. Thank you all for joining us today. And now, let's get to the conversation. First, I want to start with some background on exactly what we're talking about. So Josie, let me turn to you, and please let's start by defining what misdemeanors are and what minor offenses are and how common are they?
Thanks so much, Ruby, for having me. So yes, we, a team of Brennan Center researchers, were able to obtain 7 years of New York City court data on misdemeanors, violations, and infractions. We also call these minor offenses. These are typically charges like disorderly conduct, graffiti, as you mentioned, shoplifting and low-level drug possession, misdemeanor assault, and driving without a license. Contrary to what most people think, misdemeanors make up the vast majority of criminal cases in New York City, about 75%. This is also seen in our national data analysis. So in New York City and in the nation, misdemeanors are 75%, 3/4 of our criminal cases. These cases are quite time-consuming. Our study found that cases average about 3 to 4 months, including those that are dismissed and cleared with no conviction. The research shows that these misdemeanor cases have lasting impacts. Even an arrest will affect lost jobs and earnings, housing, and more.
Thank you so much for that overview. Now, Bria, can I turn to you and ask you to just talk a little bit more about what Josie alluded to, about the long-term consequences of being arrested or convicted of a misdemeanor?
Yeah, and first let me just say thank you so much for inviting me for this conversation today. Really excited to be here and happy to also be a supporter of this very important publication that you all released last month. So for the MacArthur Foundation's Criminal Justice Program, our lead initiative is called the Safety and Justice Challenge, and it's focused on the misuse and overuse of jails. And we intentionally decided to focus on jails because we knew that there's nearly 12 million admissions annually into our local city and county jails, which is the population of both New York City and Los Angeles combined. We also understand that 3 out of 5 people in jail are legally presumed innocent, meaning they're just sitting there either awaiting legal representation, still waiting for their charges to be processed, so on and so forth. And we also know that jails disproportionately impact people of color, especially our Black, Latino, and Native American population. And so we decided to create what we called the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is now a network of almost 80 different cities and counties across the country that are identifying locally driven solutions, bringing together different criminal justice stakeholders, community-based organizations, advocates to really think critically about what are the needs of their local communities, what do they need to not only reduce jail populations, but also the racial and ethnic disparities, and how do you sort of continue to support the holistic rehabilitation and less of the punitive focus on jail. And I think what we understood from this undertaking, which we are now in our 8th year of this initiative, is that there are a lot of different overlapping structural factors as to why people end up in the jail system. And I think your report does a great job of highlighting a lot of those, where we typically see communities that are underemployed or lack employment opportunities. There's issues around food insecurity, housing instability, as well as other factors that oftentimes lead to more police surveillance, or also just instances where crime becomes more of an attractive option. And so one of the things that we're really hoping to understand more is that the criminal justice system should not be used for some of these practices that we're seeing across the country, that we really need to think more holistically and collectively across different systems, including our housing, education, labor, and employment systems, to really figure out how do we think about community safety, how do we safely reduce jail populations, and how do we make sure that we're not using jails for some of these more nuanced crimes, such as some of the shoplifting crimes, or because people don't have stable housing, and what are some of those alternatives that we can be lifting up and modeling across the country.
Thank you. Now let me turn to you, Jerry. In your role as sheriff, speaking to and responding to some of what Bria alluded to, what have you seen as the impact on the sheriff's office and on the county government and the resources that are required to pursue enforcement against misdemeanors? Oh, I think you might be on mute.
I thought I was off. So thank you. So first, thanks, and I really appreciate the conversation, because if we're really going to change how we make a better what we call community wellness and community safety, we have to change what we've been doing, and obviously what we're doing now does not work. I think we've invested so much money and so much time incarcerating folks that if we do the right kind of risk analysis, they do not pose a risk to community. I've been in this job for 16 years in Washington County for 36, and I've always looked at our population, and it's always been obvious to me that half of the folks that are in our jail don't need to be in our jail. And we have a small jail compared to everyone else. And in a county of just under 400,000, we only have 400 beds, which is, if you look across the country, you would think you double or triple that. So we have seen that, but even with that, when you look at the investment in our criminal legal justice system to arrest and adjudicate misdemeanors, we're still overspending. We have people that have been arrested for misdemeanors, some of the charges that have been mentioned already, that spend time in our jail at $140, $145 a day. They do not pose a risk to community. And sometimes they'll get out and to have an alternative to incarceration, like electronic monitoring. That's still $50 a day that sometimes they're expected to pay. But many of those people are already in financial difficulties. So then the government picks up that bill. So that's more taxpayer dollars being spent. And then as they go through the adjudication process, think about how much it costs for the court to adjudicate one misdemeanor case. The court staff time, the police officer time to come in, probably on overtime to testify. So as we start to really think about it, not, from a humanity standpoint, I think we've seen enough studies that show the impact of 1 or 2 days in jail on someone, and the impact it has on family and that individual. So from a humanity standpoint, I think it's the wrong approach. From a fiscal standpoint, if we're just talking about it from a business standpoint, if you were running a private sector or a business, you would not run your business the way we engage misdemeanors in our criminal legal justice system. So I think the costs are tremendous. And I'll just end with this. Even in those jurisdictions that aggressively, so court fees and fines don't cover the true cost. They may cover a portion of the cost, but even in those jurisdictions that aggressively go after people that have gone through the process to try to collect those fines and fees, I think the success rate is very low. But think about the increased pressure that you put on an individual that's been in jail that now has to find additional money to pay those fees. I just think it's the wrong path for us to follow.
Thank you so much for that, both of you, for that national perspective, and Sheriff, for your law enforcement perspective. So let's shift gears back to New York City, the focus of the BCJ report. The report notes that there was actually a significant decrease in misdemeanor cases between 2016 and 2022. Josie, can you explain that a little bit more, what you found and what the current landscape around misdemeanor enforcement is in New York City?
Of course. So the good news is New York City did see these significant declines in misdemeanor cases. Over 50% of cases declined from 200,000 in 2016 to just under 100,000 in 2022. More study is needed, but this is likely due to decades and years of reforms that expanded alternative to jail programs in the court, as well as decriminalization of low-level offenses, most notably legalization of marijuana, but the steps preceding that as well. And in 2021 and 2022, approximately half of these cases were dismissed, cleared with no charge. And as I said before, the average case time was still 3 to 4 months, including for those that resulted in no conviction.
So just to follow up on that, one of the most significant findings in your report is that despite the significant reduction in misdemeanor cases in New York City, racial disparities in enforcement were stubbornly persistent. Can you talk a little bit more about what you found on those lines?
Absolutely. This really echoes what my esteemed colleagues, Ruby and Sheriff Clayton, have been talking about, as well as Bria. So despite these declines that were really great to see, Black and Latinos were overrepresented in these misdemeanor cases compared to their resident population. In the court data analysis, we saw that Black people were 6 times more likely and Latinos 3 times more likely to have a minor offense case, in New York City compared to their white counterparts. When we scoped out of the criminal justice data and did an analysis of New York City neighborhoods, we found that misdemeanor arrests were largely concentrated in low-income Black and Latino communities. 60 to over 90% of residents were Black and Latino. And we also saw neighborhood metrics such as higher levels of poverty, much lower household income, high levels of unemployment, much higher, double the rates and triple of the city and nation, as well as higher self-reported mental health problems. So in sum, the racial disparities in enforcement remains concentrated in these communities. We wanted to understand the context behind the numbers and what's happening both in enforcement and why these racial disparities persist. And we engaged 166 stakeholders from law enforcement and business leaders, government officials, community nonprofit providers, advocates, and especially Black and Latino leaders who have been directly and indirectly impacted by the criminal legal system. Again, this really echoes what Bria and the sheriff were saying, but we heard that this is really about ongoing disinvestment and racial segregation contributing to the lack of resources in low-income Black and Latino communities. This leads to the metrics that we see: higher poverty, unemployment, housing instability, food insecurity, mental health and addiction challenges, all of which were exacerbated over the pandemic. And we definitely heard, as the sheriff just said, that punishment-only practices are not working. They are ineffective to address the root causes of what is driving people into the system, such as addiction, lack of housing, and mental health needs. So this really deepens the existing law enforcement presence in the lives of low-income Black and Latino communities, and it really exacerbates the problem as well.
Thank you. Those are pretty stark numbers in terms of just both the racial disparities that you saw, as well as the underlying factors. So let me turn to you, Bria. Would you say that these persistent racial disparities that Josie just talked about, and the structural factors that they found in New York City's minor offense enforcement, do they hold true in other locations that you've been able to look at through the work you've been doing at MacArthur?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree 100% with Josie said, and I don't want to echo everything because she stated it so well. But what I will say in our own data that from the Safety and Justice Challenge, while we have seen overall reductions in jail populations, which we're ecstatic about, and actually our Safety and Justice Challenge sites are seeing reductions that are even higher than the national average, I think to Josie's point, what has continued to persist is the racial and ethnic disparities. And for our network, it's particularly true for our Black, Latino, and Native American population. One of the things that we are noting is that overall, there are fewer misdemeanors in local jails and county jails, and that is a good thing. And one of the grappling questions and one of the challenges that we're now facing is what about people who are charged with higher level crimes, if it's felony or violent crimes? And also too, doing more of an assessment for some of those misdemeanors where folks can't be released or maybe do not qualify for a diversion program, so on and so forth. So I think that's sort of the next step, and that's the next challenge for this conversation and also for our Safety and Justice Challenge communities. But I don't think necessarily that we should be discouraged that there are still persistent racial and ethnic disparities. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are seeing some declines. It's just not as dramatic as it is for the white population. And I still do think that there is a lot of collective action that should be taking place because these disparities have existed for, quite frankly, centuries. So it is going to take time to see, I think, the numbers that we want, and hopefully the eventual elimination of these racial and ethnic disparities. And one of the recommendations that we try to lift up through the Safety and Justice Challenge Network is to make sure that we're working across our communities, that we're being inclusive of people when we're thinking about how do we reduce jail population safely, how do we think about criminal justice reform. It requires a collective response. It's not just a response from the criminal justice system, but it's a response from all of us.
So let me ask you just sort of a follow-up question to that. It sounds like MacArthur does do a lot of work helping to actually evaluate and uncover such disparities. And why is that? Is that true? And if so, how do you do that? And how is that done? And why is that, why would you consider that an important part of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a data-driven initiative. We have a number of partners that help us regularly analyze jail admissions data, booking, arrest, even representation, what reentry services are available. We really sort of want to understand each individual's experience with the criminal justice system. And that requires looking at a number of different factors that would rather, affect someone's release from jail or someone's continued incarceration. So across our jurisdictions, we collect this data, we regularly analyze it. We work with our local communities to make sure that there are data people in place that can also do this data analysis and collection. And then also we want to make sure that there's a mechanism for dissemination and regular reporting with communities. So in some places we have data dashboards that are public that provide information about racial and ethnic disparities, provide information around jail admissions, so that people have a clear understanding and picture of what's happening in their local communities. And I think a well-informed community is, one clear avenue to make sure that then they can fight for the resources that are necessary, that they can pose questions, or also, more importantly, provide solutions, policy recommendations, and changes that we know need to be incorporated into the criminal justice system. So when I say data too, I also want to be mindful that data comes in a lot of different ways. So we do collect sort of that numerical, what we call case level data, but we also collect qualitative information where we're talking to people with lived experience, those that have been involved in the justice system, where we're talking to prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, and other actors to sort of understand their experience with the criminal justice system. So we take all of that into account when we're saying that this is a data-driven initiative.
So I want to turn to you, Jerry. As the elected sheriff in Washtenaw County, you have done some similar data work in your jurisdiction. Can you explain what you have done and found related to racial disparities, and also why you decided that was important to do?
Yeah, well, I think I'll start with why I decided it's important. You know, I say this a lot to folks. I mean, it's obvious when you see me that I'm African-American male. And I talk about that. So my experience in this country, 59 years as an African-American male raising sons, and then 36 years in this business has really influenced how we go about doing this work. When we think about the racial disparities, we try to take a step back and say, well, what's the cause? What's really fueling these racial disparities? And we know, and both of my fellow panelists here spoke to the socioeconomic issues, right? So we know historical disinvestment in some of our most challenging and vulnerable communities really create that fertile soil, right? Poverty and housing insecurity and health insecurity, behavioral health. The fact that we have not invested in those communities has created that fertile ground. And then we have that systemic racism and the zero tolerance policies. So as we think about zero tolerance policies, the war on drugs, to a large degree, broken windows theory, as I think through that from a professional standpoint, and then start to look at the impact of that, both on quote unquote driving down crime, but equally as important, the disparate impact it's had on people of color and poor folks. We have to take a step back and say, this is not the outcomes we want. So it shouldn't be the strategies we put in place. So one of the things that we stepped back and we said, well, also let's look at our policy practices. A lot of what's driven in terms of when we get these disparities is how we use our discretion. Officers in communities, they get to decide who they stop, who they search. All the post-stop activities is really discretionary. So we have to examine that and say, is that driving some of the disparities? Where we deploy our staff. So we know wherever we put more police, we increase the likelihood of contacts. When you increase the likelihood of contacts, you increase the likelihood of people going to jail. So even when community says, Sheriff, we want you in our community enforcing these things, I'll listen to that and say, yes, we will deploy more staff, but it's how we operate in those areas that make the difference. So when we put in place in October of 21, our law enforcement assisted diversion and deflection program, it was designed, and one of our ultimate outcomes is to reduce the racial disparity of our actions in the community. When I look at Washtenaw County, which is 14% African American, I look at our jail, which is 50%, and we start to look at who gets stopped and who gets searched and who gets arrested, we know that this is not acceptable. So we know that it is operational practices that make the difference. So we looked at our policies. Having a lead program is important, right? And we know that's diversion and deflection, low-level offenses. Instead of taking them to jail, instead of them entering the criminal legal justice system, connecting them to services, that's one thing. But I don't want to lose sight of the culture of the organization, because there are other folks that we come in contact with that are not eligible for lead, but still shouldn't end up in jail, or should be connected to services. So it's the individual programs, but it's also our overall practices and operational protocols that we have to be intentional about if we're really serious about creating community wellness and safety in a way that doesn't have a disparate impact on any group, but especially groups for 400 years that have realized that, and that's African Americans and other people of color.
Thank you for that. And you started alluding to some, we've talked a lot about the daunting challenges of misdemeanor enforcement and the impact, particularly the racial disparities. And you've alluded to some potentially promising approaches to address those, which I'd like to now explore a little bit more with the rest of the panel. So first of all, Josie, in the study, you examined some of the programs that New York City has actually implemented in recent years, alternatives to arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, And I want you to talk a little bit more about what those, some of the most promising of those initiatives and how they have been implemented and what the challenges have been, in, particularly in scaling them.
Absolutely, Ruby. And I just want to lift up that, like Bria and the MacArthur Foundation and the sheriff, we really believe in tapping multiple forms of knowledge and expertise. So it was really important to us to continue to go back to our impacted community experts and make sure that our data findings, our themes, as well as our recommendations were aligned with their recommendations along with our stakeholders. So we saw a lot of common ground, and this is supported by growing research about some of the hopeful and promising solutions to address these inequities in minor enforcement. They require a lot more investment, but they are programs and places that focus on behavioral health, housing instability, as well as crime prevention, using cross systems and community-based approaches. There are currently, as I said, small-scale strategies that need to be ramped up. These include successful court diversions, especially as early stage as possible to avoid as much of the court process as possible and these lasting consequences. These are programs like Project Reset in New York City and the community courts that aim to connect people with services that address their needs, from mental health and substance abuse treatment to housing assistance to job and vocational assistance, identification, and more. We heard a lot about the need to build up infrastructure to respond to behavioral health needs because jails have become the default system. This include co-response models like police and trained mental health professionals working together to respond to behavioral health crises, as well as alternative response models like Be Heard in New York, where trained emergency medical technicians and paramedics, along with social workers, work together to respond to behavioral health crises. We also heard about long-standing community models like those developed by Fountain House in New York City, where people with severe mental illness are at the lead and self-determining what they need, whether it's in all of the different needs, but also contributing to community building efforts, as well as their jobs, educations, and more. We heard a lot about expanding very limited but much needed supportive housing spots for especially justice-involved people. That is housing with wraparound and comprehensive services like the many that I mentioned around mental health, substance use, education, and opportunity overall. And we also heard about investing in crime prevention models, especially those called co-production of public safety, where law enforcement, local government, community providers, and especially communities, impacted communities, are working together to build community safety and well-being, from how we intervene in violence and prevent it to how we build up physical infrastructure in urban spaces, urban gardens, and greening, which make a real impact on the lives of people.
So I'm going to turn it back to Jerry. You started alluding to LEAD and some of the other programs that you've implemented. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk about some of those reforms that you've implemented, but also how you've gone about doing it in the cross-sector way that both Bria and Josie have talked about, partnering with community mental health partners and others.
Yeah, I think it's the only way to do this. I'm always concerned and troubled when we try to come up with these solutions in silos. You know, communities, and listen, I understand the history of policing over 400 years. I understand the tenuous relationship between the profession and African Americans and poor people and other people of color. I've lived part of that, so I clearly understand that. And I also push real hard with my colleagues, many of them that are already there, some that aren't, that I hope that get there, to understand that we have to be serious about thinking differently in our profession and changing the culture from the ground up consistently. But even with all that, I'm always concerned when the frustration level has gotten with our community folks to say, we want to do this separate from the police, totally separate from the police. Because it's my belief, from a leadership perspective, extraordinary things happen not based on individual work, but collective work. So we've always tried to do that in Washington County. So I advocate this continuum of community responders. So I'm not an alternative responder person. I'm an appropriate responder person. I believe that you build systems based on risk and need, where you can address the risk and need across this continuum, because nothing's ever clean. And you can send the appropriate responder at the right time, at the right place, with the right intervention or solution for that individual so they're whole. You can't do that in isolation. So what we've tried to do in Washington County is say, look, we should be partnering with our community mental health partners, which we do. And we ended up with a public safety mental health village. We should be partnering with our housing community and education community. It's only if we do this collectively can we get the outcomes that we want. So LEAD was put in place. And in most places, LEAD's not led by a police agency or a sheriff's office. But for us, we knew we wanted to at least get it kickstarted. We had the ability to do it. But we're partnered with our public defender and our prosecutor and our mental health, our community mental health, all of us collectively sitting around the table. Because quite frankly, the same individuals that our community mental health clinicians are interacting with in their offices and in their homes are sometimes the same people our deputy sheriffs are interacting with in the street. So why wouldn't we share information that's legally shared, share resources, share perspective, and quite frankly, share the same ultimate outcome of community wellness and safety? So we've tried to move in that direction. And the last thing I'll say, like with co-response was driven by us. What we can't do co-response without community mental health being that partner. So putting that deputy sheriff and that master's level clinician in a car together, responding to calls that are risk and need related, and then trying to find a solution for those individuals, I think are critical. Those folks spend, I think, more time on self-initiated activity going into some of our camps with people that are housing insecure and food insecure with behavioral health disorder, proactively going into those communities and developing relationships and connecting them to resources. That's how I think we start to build the kind of models that get us on the other side of where we want to be. And the last thing I'll say, and one of my colleagues said this, and I was so happy she said it, is she talked about these things take time. And I know people get impatient because we've been talking about the same thing for a long period of time. But if we really want sustainable, real change, we have to do it thoughtfully and deliberately, and we have to put the mechanisms in place so we can sustain it. I'll end right there.
So related to that, are you doing any evaluation of any of these programs? And if so, can you explain how you're doing that?
Yeah, sorry about that. So for our lead, I think for co-response, we have hired University of Chicago Health Lab to do the evaluation. And really the original evaluation was an implementation evaluation. So if this is going to be replicated, what's the model to help replicate this, not only just throughout our county, but on a national basis? So they're working with us there. They've got a dashboard that they've created that we're going to hopefully go live here in the next couple of months that really starts to lay out some of the demographics and some of the work of our co-response. Our lead initiative is being evaluated locally by University of Michigan. It's called CHART. So they're evaluating our lead. And quite frankly, we haven't been, I think, as thoughtful as we should have been with some of our earlier programs in terms of documenting the development of those programs and evaluating the impact. But I think we've gotten smarter now, and I'm really excited about the outcome of those evaluations. I will say this, the one I'm really excited about is several years ago, partnering with CMH, we looked at our jail and CMH data and really did a deep dive into who's in our jail. And two things we found out. If you had a behavioral health disorder, your average length of stay was double, and your propensity for recidivism was double. So now we're trying to measure the impact of some of this other work that we're doing to see if we're driving those numbers down.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So I do want to remind the audience that we please put your questions in the chat because we definitely are going to open it up for Q&A to address audience questions in just a few minutes. But let me turn back to Bria to talk a little bit. You know, both Josie and Jerry, as well as you, have talked about kind of the evolution of how we have been responding to things like misdemeanor enforcement and policing in recent years, and thinking about different approaches and community-led approaches to public safety. How have you seen the criminal justice reform landscape change in recent years? And have you encountered more of an appetite for reform, or is there still a lot of pushback?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I came into this role about 5 years ago, and I would say the appetite for reform there's very much a big hunger and desire. I'm in Chicago. They just passed bail reform, as did New York. A couple of other states were really sort of looking at, um, why are we holding people in jail and having them pay these large fines and fees? And there were a lot of other programs and changes that were happening at the same time. I think what the sheriff has spoke about, and also Josie. So I won't go into all those details, but I think the idea that we need to think more critically about who are the people inside our jail, why are they in our jail, and are there ways to get them out, and also ways to not even have them in the criminal justice system altogether, were all kinds of questions that I think we were grappling with over the last 5 years. And then I think with the advent of COVID in 2020, as well as George Floyd's murder was just another unfortunate Black death that happened, and I think they coincided at the same time. There was a big reflection and reaction to what is really the purpose of the criminal justice system. I think through COVID, you saw a huge number of people being released. You saw also different ways that we were using law enforcement because you didn't want people in jail. So you saw fewer arrests, you saw fewer bookings. And also there was more of an appetite to start thinking more critically about the racial inequities, again, sort of stemming from George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and just so many other Black people that were unfortunately killed at the hands of the justice system. And it's an interesting time now, I will say, to be working in criminal justice reform. I still think there's an appetite, but I do have a sense that the pendulum is swinging a little bit back towards being more conservative, being a little bit risk averse. I think there's a question around community safety, despite the fact that the data shows across the country that violent crime is down. I think individually, there's a sense that just people feel unsafe. And I struggle with that question. I wonder, what are the causes of why individuals feel unsafe? What is it? Are there certain factors that we should be thinking about? But also at the same time, it's still an opportunity for us not to take our, foot off the gas. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of changing the system. I still think there's ways that we can lift up successful practices and models through different storytelling, communications, similar to, the report and what it's highlighting. There's still opportunities for us to be inclusive of who is advocating for this criminal justice reform. And I don't necessarily think that the appetite has, changed so much that we can't do anything that it's leading to inaction. But I will say that there is a little bit of a pause and a little bit of a question around, what we can do, what we can coalesce around. I think the last thing I'll say is the fact that we are seeing more people experiencing behavioral health substance use disorders and people questioning if jail is the right place to address those serious issues, that is providing an opportunity for us to sort of reevaluate and, think more critically about what types of care and resources these individuals need. And so I think that in some ways is a positive reaction to it. And I also think we are starting to think more critically about what does it mean for reentry services and rehabilitation, and the bigger question of what is the purpose of the criminal justice system.
Thank you for that. And let me turn to you, Jerry, to sort of follow up and your thoughts over your many decades as a law enforcement leader in your community. Have you seen a shift in how people have been responsive to the justice reform measures that you've been championing, and also the concerns that Bria alluded to about public safety? How do you address that?
Yeah, so in Washington County, I think the appetite is still strong for reforms, almost to the extent of, Washington County and Ann Arbor to some degree was what I was talking about in terms of this siloed approach that we want to do it totally absent of the police. And, I've always seen us as being a leader in this space. I mean, we were doing some of these things prior to George Floyd, and when 8 Can't Wait and all that was coming out, we were like, well, we've already done that. We've done it for years. We got policies, and I think our folks have sort of gotten used to that. I think there is an appetite for it. I think there's an appetite for the reform. My worry again is in other areas across the country, and I think Bria spoke to this, maybe that pendulum swinging back to more of a conservative bent. I think some of that, again, is because people had been under pressure for so long. I think community members didn't feel heard for so long. And when it was time, and when they were heard and they talked about what they wanted, this immediate reaction to get it done tomorrow, I think sometimes led to less than thoughtful and strategic implementation of some of these things. And I think it gave space for a narrative in more conservative spaces to say, see, that doesn't work. And the other thing is, I think that there was lack of commitment there. In Washington County, COVID, I think we also talked about the jail populations going down in COVID. Our jail population went down 50%. 50%. And guess what? Our crime didn't go up. Things didn't go wild. And I caution folks to, let's not let that pendulum swing back and go back to incarcerating folks. But, we're slowly creeping in that direction. So part of the thing that I think about in terms of how do we sustain this appetite for change and reform is we have to look at from a societal perspective. Look, police and how they act, the criminal legal system and how it conducts itself is reflective of societal values and culture. So we cannot try to change the pieces in the system without also looking at the larger societal culture and challenging the basic assumptions that are driving some of the people that get put in office and the decision makers and all the things that go along with that.
Thank you so much. And so I think we this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'd love to continue. We do need to shift to audience questions, which I'm excited to field. And let me take a look. So here's the first one that I'm going to pick out. I think for you, Josie, could researchers replicate this study in another jurisdiction? And if so, what are the key pieces of data that they would need access to?
Yes, absolutely. To more research and more partnerships. So it would be critical, of course, to have access to some form of reliable criminal justice data at the police, court, and or corrections stages, ideally more than one. In some of the jurisdictions, too, this is public, but more likely you would need a wonderful criminal justice partner like the sheriff himself here, as he's built these partnerships as well. In the local precinct, the sheriff's office, the courts, and corrections. You'd really want to understand the charges, who is impacted, as well as what's happening, how they're moving through the system. The sheriff also mentioned this, but it would also be important to obtain data from other systems, if possible, like health and housing, just to add that pitch. That was a limitation in our study. And I'll also say that the public data that we were looking at the neighborhoods for were all census data, largely. So it's highly accessible to everyone. We really believe in scoping outside of the criminal justice system and understanding what's happening in our communities. Most of all, we really promote an inclusive approach, not only a wide range of stakeholders, but especially impacted community experts. We also paid and compensated our experts. They are no different from academic scholars and legal experts and system actors that we pay. We also compensated our community-based organization that helped us with study recruitment and physical space. So we promote those research, mixed methods research, as well as building critical partnerships anywhere and everywhere. And you can contact us anytime.
So this is a related, just a follow-up question related to the data collection. What were the challenges involved in gathering data on misdemeanor cases in New York City, particularly the racial and ethnic disparities?
It can be hard to obtain criminal justice data, which I know Bria knows well, and she has fierce research organizations and partners working with her. It is why, especially for public access, and some of the racial ethnic data, for example, is not standardized across different areas, different offices across the state. And so we were really fortunate to obtain non-public court data thanks to the Office of Court Administration for the New York State Courts. I'm also a longtime court researcher, which is part of why that was the case. But if anyone wants to talk about that, please contact us anytime.
So let me throw this question at Bria and Jerry, and you can each take it separately. How have you built buy-in for reforms and initiatives across stakeholders in your communities? Maybe I'll start with Bria.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things that we're seeing in the Safety and Justice Challenge are a couple of options. One, we've seen the creation of community engagement groups. They take on a variety of forms, but typically they start with someone from the county government or criminal justice coordinating council wanting to create and oftentimes co-create such a structure. So they will work with a community-based organization or local organization or advocate and bring in other individuals that include people that have been justice impacted, that maybe include someone from your faith-based organizations, as well as stakeholders that work within the criminal justice system, from law enforcement, prosecution, judges, probation, and just other individuals that have some touch point with the systems, and bring them together and meet regularly and sort of talk about how do you perceive the criminal justice system, what's working, what is not working, and then also provide opportunities for regular community engagement. So that could be either taking in the form of listening sessions, but when I say listening sessions, I don't mean just talking at the community, but really working with community to identify some of those community-driven solutions, and also providing more opportunities for engagement, for their own participation throughout this process. Because I think what all of us has talked about is that the criminal justice system is a local problem. It's going to require local solutions, obviously with federal, national, and state support, but it is the stakeholders within your community ultimately that know what's best, know what they want, know what they desire, and also know what changes they want to see happen.
Yeah, I think Bria hit a lot of the points, but I'll say if you're trying to develop relationships with not just community but any stakeholder group in the midst of the crisis, it's way too late. Or in the midst of now, I want us to partner on something, I think sometimes it's too late. So we've been in office since '09, and that was one of the things we led with. We hired folks that were, my director of community engagement was a social worker with grassroots experience, just to teach us from this profession, how do you authentically engage community at an organic level. We would do enhancing police and community workshops where, again, we're not talking at folks, telling them what they need and what outcomes they should be seeking for community wellness and safety, but learning from them what they need, and also learning how we're delivering the services impact them. And I think and we're always striving for one level above buy-in. Quite frankly, we're striving both internally and externally for commitment, which in my mind means what we're trying to do and the message that we're putting out, and the what we're trying engages folks right here and here. They commit when their heart's there, right? We've aligned values and belief system, and we spend a lot of our initial time talking about what outcome do we want. Help me create a vision for me. If we do it right, whatever that is, what will your experience be? What will it look like? And we can work backwards from there. If we can agree on, at the end of the day, what the ultimate outcome is, and we focus on that, then I can navigate all the other disagreements, and we can start to develop strategies to get us to what the shared vision of the outcome is.
So let me go to another interesting question in the chat. Are there approaches to misdemeanor enforcement in other countries that would be worth replicating in the United States? I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that and can speak to that.
I mean, I don't have a specific example. I will say the European countries do just have a different viewpoint on what the purpose of the criminal justice system is. So if you were to look internationally, I think whereas the United States, you could argue that our system is much more punitive and we think about it as a form of punishment, their viewpoint is rehabilitation. So the sentences aren't as long, the charges are very different. I think the resources and the way they describe and think about rehabilitation is very different from the United States approach. So while I don't have a specific example to give, I would just, maybe it's a question we could come back to, offline and send some resources, because I do have some colleagues that would know more about that.
Thank you. Yes, I think also probably some of the resources for some of the services that we've alluded to may be different in other societies. So let me ask this another question from the audience. Has any of your work focused specifically on the harms associated with charging young people with misdemeanors and how they would benefit from different approaches to enforcement?
I mean, I'm happy to start. So we are an adult-driven initiative, meaning that we tend to focus on people that are 18 and older, and not, if the question was specifically asking about juveniles or youth, it's a little bit different. But I will say we do look at people who are between the ages of 18 to 26, 24 to 26 slightly differently, because the science and the brain development all shows that, you know, they aren't really full adults at that young age, and also, you know, very impressionable. So there's a question about whether some of the more severe consequences and penalties should be in place for the younger population that is currently in jail. So one of the alternatives we have seen is young adult diversion strategies, particularly those that have a first-time offense for a low-level misdemeanor, whether it's sometimes, you know, drug possession, some gun offenses. And we've also seen more of the young adult courts come up. So again, we're not putting them in with the older population, I will say that loosely, population, but I think we do recognize that there are some differences. And also maybe we need to be thinking more strategically about different accommodations for the younger population, and think about ways to get them out of the system so that they don't cycle back in and out, because I still think that there is an opportunity to hopefully change their trajectory so that it's not necessarily focusing back on the criminal justice system, but hopefully giving them opportunities so that they still can lead productive lives.
Yeah, I'll comment not as much on, you know, specifically on the question of the charging and the young folks, but I will talk about, I think that more and more focus is on our juveniles. I know in Washington County we're really looking hard on our juvenile system and what additional harms we're causing based on how we are responding to some of their behavior, and not just the youth themselves, but the support for those youth. So we started a program called Sure Moms, which is Sisters United, Resilient, and Empowered. And it's a trauma-informed group to help mothers of juveniles that are in our system, because what we're finding is the young folks would go and maybe they're in the system or in the juvenile facility, and then they get out and maybe they get connected to services and they're in an environment that may be calmer than they have been in a while. And then they get out and they go right back to the environment that I think was impacting them for additional trauma. And what we're finding out is the mothers who were there and parenting the kids had their own trauma. And until they worked through their trauma, they couldn't help their young folks get on the right path and work through there. So I think there's so many things that we need to focus on, and so many avenues we need to address to make sure we put up the right infrastructure to support our young folks to keep them out of the system.
Thank you for that. So so sad to say that we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to leave the audience with one last question for each of you, which is, what is the one thing that you would want our audience to walk away with this afternoon? And I guess I'll throw it first to Bria, and then to Jerry, and then Josie.
All right. I was thinking about this question. I just want people to stay hopeful. I know, particularly right now, it feels like it's tough to either work in criminal justice. It's tough to think about racial justice. It's a challenging environment, you know, across the board. But I don't want to lose sight of the lot of changes and the positive things that we've seen happen, especially over these last, 10 or so years collectively. There's been a lot of great work across communities. There's been a lot of great work that we've seen, and I think there's more driven, focused attention on really questioning, again, sort of what is the purpose of our criminal justice system, and also thinking more about a collective response to, community safety, understanding, I think we've all touched upon this, that this is an ecosystem question. This requires not just a response from criminal justice, but also from health, housing, education, employment, and all of, the different services and resources that are available in our local community. So I hope people will stay hopeful, stay in the fight, because there's still a lot of work to be done, but we also, take some credit for some of the wins that we've seen along the way.
I guess if it's on. Look, I will echo everything Bria just said. I love the fact that she said it the way she said it. First of all, thanks for inviting me and including me on the panel because you are modeling, I believe, what the solution is for us. That if we are going to accomplish the outcomes and every community be well and safe, then we must do this together. That we must look past sometimes historical, the history, and the fact that everybody is not on the same page, and come together and decide here's how we're going to move forward as a collective to get to the outcomes that we need to get to. And that includes everyone. And I think we need to broaden this whole discussion around criminal justice reform to, I'll say again, societal reform. So think about this. Even the most successful diversion, deflection programs can't compensate for the ongoing and decades-long disinvestment in our communities. It can't compensate for it. So we have to be able to address those root cause issues around poverty and education and health. All of those things will be contributing factors to us being safe and well communities. And it's going to take all of us together, not looking to see who we can blame, but who we can partner with to get to the outcomes that I think we're all looking for. Thanks again for having me and including me in the discussion.
Thank you so much to my esteemed panelists and to Ruby. I'll just recap and say, as a reminder, misdemeanors are the vast majority of our criminal systems in New York City and across the country. It's great to see the declines, but our study did find significant racial disparities impacting Black and Latino people and communities, which has been replicated again and again in studies in New York City and across our nation. So as the sheriff and Bria said, addressing enforcement and these disparities really requires this inclusive and structural approach to understanding the drivers and the needs and really meeting those needs in health and housing and communities prevention. We were also happy to say that we met a lot of people and organizations that were not just doing the work on the ground and in policy and research, but also happy to share. So I do agree that there is cause for hope and optimism, and we need it. We need to do the work.
Thank you to our audience for all of your questions. I wish we had time to answer them all. The Brennan Center looks forward to seeing you at future events. To be the first to know when events are announced, be sure to sign up for the events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. I am Rosemary Nadiri, and thank you to all of our panelists for this wonderful and really engaging and informative conversation. And thank you all for coming.